What's going on, everybody? GoodMicWork commentaries back at you. Welcome to another edition of This Day in History. We've got a really fun show to take a look back at this week, a very significant show in WWE history, and that, of course, is King of the Ring 1998. Goes down on June 28th, 1998, 20 years ago today, and I cannot believe it has been that long. I cannot believe it has been a full 20 years since this extremely significant pay-per-view in wrestling history, and most people know this pay-per-view and remember this pay-per-view for one thing and one thing only, and that's Mick Foley's fucking base jumping exhibition that probably shaved 10 to 20 years off of his lifespan and putting his entire body, life, and career on the line for the sake of a good match, and it's what everybody remembers. But there is a few other things about this pay-per-view that I think are really significant, so we're gonna dig a little bit deeper here in King of the Ring 1998, go back and take a look at some of these matches and a few interesting tidbits that were on this pay-per-view, and then of course we also had a pretty big main event between Stone Cold Steve Austin and Kane that goes down, I believe, as one of the greatest pay-per-view endings of all time, at least during this era in WWE. So this was a really significant show for me personally, and as you guys know, I usually do these type of videos based on my own personal memories of the show. You're never going to hear me do This Day in History or a pay-per-view review on a show that I never saw, or at least that I didn't see live. And during this time, every single month, I always had it ordered on pay-per-view. We had friends over. I had 2 or 3 VCRs hooked up to the same TV, all with tapes going to record the show, and I was an absolute madman. So I have a lot of memories of this pay-per-view, and what a crazy night it was. Now, back in 1998, 20 years ago, things were a lot different in WWE, and technology was a lot different as well. And what I personally remember about this pay-per-view, a little personal story about Greg Morgan, is that I had been on my own and living on my own for a few years by that point, and had a decent job and was making a little bit of money. I didn't really have a lot of money. I was living in an apartment, but I had a little bit of disposable income to play with. So I decided that I wanted to upgrade my television. And I went out like an idiot and purchased one of those big, giant, big screen TVs that you would see in the 90s. They were heavy as shit. They weighed about 2 tons, and they were on rollers, like wheels, and you could wheel them around your house. And they were pretty, heavy duty back then. And that was the best TVs you could really get. And they were expensive as shit. And I went out and bought one of those less than 2 weeks before this pay-per-view aired. So I had only had this thing for a few days. It had to be delivered to my apartment. And I even remember watching the pay-per-view with my friends on this TV. I didn't even have the entertainment center, which I also purchased, this giant oak heavy-ass entertainment center. I didn't have that set up yet. So the TV was kind of just in the middle of the living room. And that's how we watched this King of the Ring, and it looked badass because back then I went from like a 22-inch TV to this monstrous 50-inch. And as a matter of fact, I have a picture that some of you have seen of one of my apartments that I had this TV in. This is when I lived with one of my buddies, and check out this Attitude Era living room. I mean, holy shit. So this is the TV that I purchased just a few days before King of the Ring 1998. Boy, did I pick one hell of a pay-per-view to start watching on one of these giant-ass TVs with what we would see later on with Mick Foley. So anyway, just a little personal story there from GoodMicWork. Like I said, I'm going to run through the card here, but there was a lot of kind of dud, meaningless, pointless, boring matches on this pay-per-view. And even the King of the Ring tournament itself had kind of lost its luster, I guess you would say. Around 1996, when Austin won it, they started structuring the tournament different. They were doing it on TV, and they would save only the final 4 for the pay-per-view broadcast itself. Now, Austin, of course, with his great promo, made that King of the Ring amazing. The next year with Triple H, it wasn't quite as great, and this year we had Ken Shamrock, set to win this thing, and a potential finals matchup with Dan Severn, which I thought would have been really fun, but the tournament itself was kind of like, I don't want to necessarily say it was boring, it just didn't feel as prestigious, I guess, as some previous King of the Ring tournaments, and it just stopped feeling quite as special, and that would continue on for another couple of years, and then WWE would go ahead and scrap the entire pay-per-view concept completely. So despite the fact that this pay-per-view had the potential to suck, it really didn't, and it goes down as one of the most memorable pay-per-views in the history of that company. So the show opens up with Taka Michinoku teaming up with the Headbangers, and they defeated Kai and Tai. Really nothing special in that match. It was, they were right in the middle of Taka. I can't remember. This was before his heel turn, I believe. So this is a really lower to mid card feud, really unimportant, and it was pretty much just a card filler, curtain jerker there, and decent match. And in the end, the babyfaces won, and not much to really say about it. Next up, we had the first King of the Ring tournament match on this show, and that was Ken Shamrock versus Jeff Jarrett. And Shamrock makes Jarrett tap out with the ankle lock in pretty quick fashion there. So Shamrock was on a roll, and he's into the finals now, and he's set to face the winner of, get this, The Rock versus Dan Severn. I mean, what a match, right? Dan the Beast Severn taking on The Rock. The Rock has taken on a couple of beasts in his life with Brock Lesnar and Dan Severn. So this is a really interesting match to go back and look at from 1998, 20 years ago, that this match actually happened, and it happened on a pay-per-view. And everybody was thinking, and I was too, based on what we had already seen between The Rock and Ken Shamrock, they had already feuded. They had already had a storied rivalry dating back 6 months. So I thought they were going to do a Ken Shamrock versus Dan Severn final. I thought Severn would figure out a way to beat The Rock, and he would take on Ken Shamrock in kind of like a rubber match, because they both faced each other in the UFC, I think, twice. Shamrock won the first one, Severn won the second one. I might have that reversed, but I know they were 1-1. So if they were to meet in the King of the Ring finals here, that would have been really interesting. This was the beginning. I mean, who would have thought 20 years ago we started seeing the first sort of UFC WWE kind of crossover here. So I'm surprised they didn't go with that final, but looking back, Dan Severn, I mean, there was nothing charismatic whatsoever about the guy. He didn't even have a good look. He had a terrible physique, a creepy porn star pedophile mustache. You know, he couldn't talk on the mic at all. He had one facial expression. And in WWE's world, Dan the Beast Severn didn't really have a whole lot to offer. Dan Severn would have been much better in the NWA, in Japan, places like that. And he did wrestle a little bit all over the world, but WWE just was not for him. So when he's going up against the exact opposite of him, I mean, think about it. The Rock and Dan Severn are the polar opposites of each other in terms of what a professional wrestler should be. You know, The Rock is arguably the most charismatic person in the history of the business. Dan Severn is arguably the least charismatic person in the history of the business. There's not too many people on Dan Severn's level or The Rock's level. So it's just a really interesting match, I thought. And The Rock did get the win. He had a lot of help from the Nation of Domination. And I think Mark Henry and The Godfather had come out. I think they were initially sent away by the referee, but they had showed back up during the match to distract the referee. He had his back turned, and that's when D'Lo Brown showed up and nailed Dan Severn with the frog splash from the top rope. Now, Dan Severn had injured D'Lo in a submission move on TV a couple of weeks before. That's what set all this up. That might have even been what led to D'Lo wearing the chest protector. I really can't remember, but I think that might have been it. So D'Lo suffered some pectoral damage there or whatever, but he hit the ring, frog splash Dan Severn behind the referee's back. Rock gets on him and pins him and moves on to the finals to face Ken Shamrock. But next up, we had Too Cool taking on Al Snow and Head. This was easily the worst thing on the pay-per-view. I hated this. It was actually making me cringe, sitting in my chair actually reliving this fucking match. The crowd was completely uninterested. They popped for nothing. And this was essentially a handicap match. It was two guys versus Al Snow and a fucking mannequin head. And to make matters worse, Jerry the King Lawler was the referee. And they tried to do some spot at the end. It was so bad. Brian Christopher, or it might have been Scotty, I don't remember. One of them got out a bottle of shampoo, Head and Shoulders, and they were trying to attach the Head and Shoulders to the head. Jim Ross was putting over Head and Shoulders. He kept saying it, Head and Shoulders, Head and Shoulders, Head and Shoulders. I remember watching it on TV, not understanding what the fuck was going on. And in the end, Too Cool got the victory, you know, since Lawler was there as the referee as well. And I remember when the 3 count hit and Too Cool were celebrating in the corner, the crowd literally did nothing. They just sat there silent during the whole thing. So this is a terrible match and one of the dumber handicap matches that we've seen. This one ranks right up there with Vince McMahon taking on Shawn Michaels and God. One of my favorite matches on the card, and it's a match that goes forgotten. A lot of people really don't talk about this match, but it was the second King of the Ring pay-per-view match between X-Pac and Owen Hart. They actually wrestled each other in the tournament of the 1994 King of the Ring. So this time, they're not in a tournament match. They're actually kind of in a mini feud with each other. X-Pac had split Owen's head open with a sick chair shot on the floor during an episode of Raw, and I think Owen's head needed to be stapled shut or whatever. Plus, this is right in the middle of the DX versus Nation feud, and Owen was a member of the Nation during that time. So they went out there and had themselves a pretty good little match. X-Pac had just gotten back in the ring. I don't remember when his first match was in 1998, but he was out of action all of 1997 from WCW with a neck injury. And even when he returned to WWE right after WrestleMania 14, he was not even cleared to wrestle yet. So I don't remember when he got back in the ring, but this was really close to his first match back in WWE. And him and Owen went out there and tore it up. There was a couple of really fun spots. There was like an Irish whip that was reversed by Owen on the outside of the ring, and he hurled X-Pac. I mean, X-Pac just flew right into the timekeeper's table, over the table, right into the barricade. Really kind of a sick bump there, and you would think almost unnecessary considering how good these two guys are in the ring. The finish was when Mark Henry ended up running out. X-Pac is on the outside of the ring. Owen is in the ring distracting the ref. Henry runs out and splashes X-Pac on the outside of the ring, only to have Vader show up. Vader, I had completely forgot that Vader was around still at this time feuding with Mark Henry. I completely forgot about this mini feud. So after Henry attacks X-Pac, Vader shows up, and in typical Vader fashion, he charges Mark Henry and hits him, and poor Vader falls down. I don't know how many times we have seen Vader fall down on TV. Poor Vader, so sad, but also so funny when he would do stuff like that. And we actually just lost Vader. Big Leon White passed away just a couple of weeks ago as of the recording of this commentary. So rest in peace to Vader. But he came out there to kind of run off Mark Henry. The two of them brawled away, and that's when Chyna got in the ring. Owen, by that point, had X-Pac back in the ring and had him in the sharpshooter. Chyna runs in, grabs Owen, hits him with a DDT. X-Pac covers him. Referee turns around, counts the 1, 2, 3. Pretty fun match there, pretty fun finish. Lots of guys involved, lots of interference, and it was a perfect way to further the Nation and DX storyline because a lot of DX and Nation members got involved. So Vader kind of being thrown out there in the middle was a nice surprise. I've not really watched this pay-per-view in a few years, so I kind of forgot about Vader and Henry. So that was a nice little surprise for me to see, and I really enjoyed reliving this match. So if you've never gotten a chance to take a look at this X-Pac and Owen Hart match from King of the Ring, it's worth your time. Pull up the network and take a look at it. You'll love it. Next up, we had a match that I'm really glad that I didn't gloss over. This was one that I was initially about to just skip right past, and that is the New Age Outlaws taking on the new Midnight Express. The Midnight Express were doing the NWA champion gimmick with Jim Cornette as their manager. Of course, it was Bob Holly and Bart Gunn, Bombastic Bob and Bodacious Bart, or maybe it's reversed. I forgot. It was a horrible gimmick, and it was a gimmick and just a tag team that just wasn't over. It didn't fit for the time, and it was just an overall really horrible, terrible idea. So I was about to skip past the match, but then I said to myself, you know what? I probably haven't even watched this match since the night that it happened. So let's take a look at it because there is some history there. Bart and Billy are both in this match. They were the Smoking Guns. They were a very decorated tag team in the early 90s there, 1993, 94, 95. I think they won the tag team titles 3 times. So I actually watched it, and it wasn't like horrible. It really wasn't a horrible match. As a matter of fact, there was a little sequence in there with Bart and Billy where they met face to face, nose to nose in the ring and did a fun little series of moves together that I thought was really good. So I pulled out my phone and my video camera while I was watching this and taking notes, and I actually recorded the little sequence and I posted it on Twitter and tweeted everybody in the match, and they all retweeted me. Bob Holly, Road Dogg, and Billy Gunn. Bart Gunn, of course, I don't think is on Twitter, and he's kind of retired from the business, but it was really cool to show that to those guys, and Billy Gunn and Road Dogg, and I think even Dustin Rhodes chimed in with a few comments on it, so that was cool. But going back and looking at that match, I couldn't believe that I was about to skip it, and I was so glad that I didn't, because it was a match that the fans and the audience didn't care about. It got no reaction whatsoever, much like the Too Cool and Al Snow head match. The fans really didn't care, but as a fan like me, you know, I saw it with 1998 eyes, and now I'm seeing it again with 2018 eyes, and the match was really not that bad. I thought it was kind of interesting, a lot of fun in the end. Chyna got involved in this match as well. She was all over the place on this pay-per-view, and she wound up nut-shotting Jim Cornette, and I think Billy might have hit the Famouser. I forgot how the finish went down, but Billy got the pin, and Road Dogg did the crotch chops completely in sync with the referee's 3 count, which I thought was hilarious, and the Outlaws had a pretty convincing win there, and they were on a roll, man. They were on the road to becoming the hottest tag team, or one of the hottest tag teams in WWE history, where the new Midnight Express was anything but. Next up, we had the finals of the King of the Ring tournament, Ken Shamrock versus The Rock, and like I said earlier, pretty predictable finish here. Shamrock, after a good little match with The Rock, wound up tapping out The Rock with the ankle lock, and Triple H was on commentary for this, and I remember laughing out loud with a couple of friends that I had over at my house that night when we were watching the show, because Triple H was saying some hilarious shit on commentary, and this was pre-Neanderthal voice Triple H. This isn't when he was like, ugh, and grunted and groaned when he talked. He had a much more higher pitched type of tone to his voice back then, and he was still very juvenile, and he was always cracking some sort of funny joke or sexual type of shit, to the point where he even screwed up. I can't remember what was said, but Jim Ross said something like, Triple H, are you bilingual? And Triple H says, well, there's a lot of bi things I am, but lingual's not one of them. And then there's like this awkward silence, and then you hear Triple H go, wait a minute, did I just mean to say that? And then Jim Ross is like, I don't think you did. So little things like that were just so funny. Triple H was trying so hard to be funny that he didn't think about what the fuck he was saying. So that was probably one of my favorite moments in commentary. I'm guessing that's on the network. I wouldn't think that they would edit that out. The version I was watching was the version that I recorded from pay-per-view that night. So I was watching the original pay-per-view broadcast when I was going through making my notes for this show, and I just laughed my ass off, and I remember marking out for Triple H's commentary during the show that night with all of my friends. But the match was pretty good. I thought Shamrock and Rock had a decent little rivalry there. That lasted a long time. It began at Survivor Series 97 and lasted all the way here until the King of the Ring, and they found a way to have Shamrock kind of get the last laugh without having to take the belt off The Rock at the same time, and it was pretty much an everybody wins type of situation. Shamrock was your 1998 winner, and it wasn't a horrible tournament or anything like that, but one that I don't look back on and remember that fondly. Next up, it's time. This is what the pay-per-view is all about. This match is what defines King of the Ring 1998, and in a lot of ways, it defines Mick Foley's career. The Hell in the Cell match. This was only the second one I believe they had done. Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker had an amazing debut Hell in the Cell match back in October of the previous year. And when I saw that match, I didn't think anything could top that. And Mick Foley has told the story many times. I mean, it's been 20 years. Mick Foley's been telling stories about this since the day it happened. I remember one of those early WWF home video VHS tape releases. Mick Foley had one. It might have been the Three Faces of Foley. All I know is I have like 5 copies of the fucking thing. But I remember the entire video was him telling stories to a very young Matt and Jeff Hardy, who were just sitting there listening to Mick tell stories about his career and taking a look back at some of these crazy matches. But he's told the story a million times that he was terrified that the match was going to be a stinker, because The Undertaker was also injured during this time. He had a really bad ankle, and he had a noticeable limp. You could see him, when he was walking around out there. He could barely walk on the damn thing. So Mick Foley basically thought if they have any chance to make this match good, they have to do something extreme. And he talked about how he was having a conversation with Terry Funk, and he had the idea of maybe starting the match on top of the cage. He's told the story a million times. So, lo and behold, the match starts. Mick Foley, or Mankind, comes out first, and he immediately climbs right up to the top of the cage. The Undertaker makes his entrance next, and he climbs up there to join him, and they start fighting on top of the cage, and this isn't like the way the Hell in the Cell is now. The Hell in the Cell now in modern times is extremely well built. It looks sturdy, it looks solid, it's even a lot taller, and it's just constructed a completely different way. Back in these early days of Hell in the Cell, this thing looks sketch as fuck. I mean, they're up there. I mean, these two guys weigh 300 pounds each, and they're stepping on this mesh cage, and it's sagging so far down that I can't believe the cage didn't break. I'm sure it was reinforced and I'm sure it was safe, but when you watch those guys walk on it, I mean, I would be up there terrified. I'm already scared of heights as it is. So they're up there brawling a little bit, of course. There's a chair up there. And eventually we get to the big spot, the spot that everybody remembers and is etched into all of our minds. Mankind is right on the edge. He's teetering on the edge of the cage, and Undertaker just grabs him from behind and launches him. And like I said, I had just bought a 50-inch TV in 1998. This shit looked pretty fucking gnarly on a screen that big during this time. And I stood up. I think everybody in the room actually stood up off of our seats. We were like, what the hell did we just see? I mean, for a brief moment, I thought Undertaker broke character. He had some sort of a personal issue with Mick Foley, and he decided to kill him on worldwide pay-per-view. That actually went through my mind, because I have never, I mean, still to this day, 20 years later, you look back at this bump and you're like, holy fucking shit. How is this dude alive? And the way he took the bump, the camera angles, the way Mick Foley soared through the air. This guy, it seemed like he was in the air for 10 minutes before he hit the ground. And it was countless replay after replay after replay. And, even looking back too, around the ring and stuff, this isn't like today where you have all of the space between the ring and the audience and you have this big black solid barricade. This was back in the day of the little fence, just the little black bar fence that went around the outside of the ring, and you didn't have nearly as much space. So when Mick Foley hit the table, he also hit the guardrail and it went flying back into the crowd. I mean, it was one of the craziest, it's still got to be the craziest bump ever taken in professional wrestling history. I mean, absolutely insane. Just for a guy like Mick Foley, a guy of that size too, just putting his body on the line like that. He's lucky he wasn't killed. And I thought that was the craziest thing we would ever see. I thought that was it. I mean, the match appeared to be over. They raised the cage. Terry Funk was out there. Vince McMahon was out there. Slaughter, all sorts of different officials. I think even Pat Patterson, all the WWE doctors. They wind up strapping Mick to the stretcher and wheeling him out. And we actually thought that the match was over. And I was totally fine with it because I'm like, you know what? We're going to watch that replay over and over and fucking over again. And that's all I needed. That's the craziest damn thing I've ever seen. And then, of course, as the stretcher is getting about halfway down the aisle, Mick Foley rises from the stretcher, and this is probably the most amazing part of the whole match. After Mick Foley falls like that, apparently dislocating his shoulder is what he talked about in a lot of interviews. And I think he even bruised a rib or bruised a kidney or something like that. He had some serious damage. And he's already not a very athletic guy as it is. I think even completely healthy and uninjured, I'm surprised Mick Foley is able to climb up something like a Hell in a Cell. That's not easy to do. And it's certainly not easy to do for a guy in Mick Foley's physical condition. So I was already surprised that he was able to climb up to that thing in the beginning of the match. But for him to climb up there after taking that bump, to me, was incredible. For a guy like Mick Foley. I mean, Ricochet could do it, guys like Neville could do it, guys like that could do it with no problem after a bump like that, but Mick Foley, that's a completely different story. So, to me, I think Mick Foley deserves a lot of credit for being able to have that much adrenaline pumping through his body that he's ignoring all the pain that he's in, and he's able to climb a 20-foot fucking fence. So he finally makes it to the top and he kind of rolls up there, and then they do the second big spot. This is the one that Mick Foley says actually hurt worse than the table bump. And one thing I will disagree with, I don't like the narrative that the cage wasn't supposed to give. I am almost 100% certain that this spot was planned. Just the way The Undertaker threw Mick Foley back into the choke slam. It wasn't really a choke slam. All he did was grab Mick Foley by the throat and push him backwards. They had to have known that that spot on the cage was gimmicked to give way when somebody fell on it. So, I don't know why they would even need to really lie about that, but as a fan, as an observer, it's pretty obvious. Wouldn't you guys agree? That spot was planned no matter what they say. But it doesn't take away from the brutality of it, planned or not, because Jesus Christ, Mick Foley goes right through it like a hot knife through butter, hits the canvas with this thud, and to make matters worse, the chair is up there. So the chair comes flying down, and apparently the chair catches Mick Foley in the face on the way down, knocks out one of his teeth that actually he swallows and ends up coming through his nose. You can't make this shit up. That iconic image of Mick Foley in the corner with a tooth in his nose and blood on his mouth. I mean, what the hell? I mean, the doctors were right in there. The minute he took that bump, that little French doctor, Francois, whatever his name was, he was in there within seconds checking on Mick Foley. And by this point, he's a mess. He is just destroyed. He's probably got a concussion, separated shoulder, bruised kidney, broken ribs. Who knows what the hell's wrong with Mick Foley? But he's in a world of shit. Undertaker then comes down from the cage. He clears all the doctors and all the agents out of the ring, even choke slams Terry Funk, and Terry Funk convulses on the mat, much like Vince McMahon did when he got stunned by Stone Cold in Madison Square Garden, and starts gyrating so much that he actually shakes his own shoes off. And Jim Ross is like, well, goddamn, I think Undertaker just choke slammed Terry Funk right out of his shoes, and that's exactly what he did. So everybody gets out of the ring, and then, if I wasn't impressed enough with Mick Foley actually getting off the stretcher and climbing up to the top of the cage again, he now gets up and winds up having a match with The Undertaker that goes another 15 minutes. He even starts forming some offense. He actually starts making a comeback on The Undertaker, even opens him up. Undertaker winds up getting cut open, and Mick Foley's hitting him with the DDTs and the pile drivers and all of his other signature moves, and then he goes outside of the ring, goes underneath the ring, pulls out a bag, and this is about the point where everybody in my house lost their shit completely. After what we had just seen him do with the big fall off the cage and now the really nasty bump into the ring, the motherfucker brings out a bag of thumbtacks and just dumps them all over the ring. And I remember just seeing that bag emptying and that just shiny waterfall of thumbtacks hitting the mat. We were losing our minds. I was like, what the hell are we watching? Because back then, even though I had seen a lot of ECW pay-per-views, this was beyond anything I had ever seen before. Even the shit that ECW was doing, New Jack was diving off the top of, basketball hoops and shit, and that was still not nearly as crazy as what Foley was doing in this match. So now he's got the thumbtacks, and this was a spot that I had not seen very many times. I maybe saw one thumbtack bump in my life, and then Mick Foley takes 2 bumps on them. First, he has The Undertaker in like a sleeper, and The Undertaker just falls backwards, and then Mick Foley lands on his back and then rolls through the thumbtacks. That was kind of the only thing I didn't like about it, it was kind of a forced thumbtack bump. I think Taker should have just done the choke slam. That's all he needed to do. Unless Foley was trying to prepare his body for the pain and he wanted to take a small bump first to prepare him for the choke slam, I don't know. But right after that, he ends up getting up and you can hear him. If you turn up the volume loud enough, you can hear Mick Foley tell the referee, tell him to choke slam me. So the referee goes over to the Undertaker and tells him that. Undertaker grabs Mick Foley and choke slams him onto the tacks. My God. And I just cannot believe what Mick Foley went through that night. It's like hell. It's like being kidnapped by the mob and tortured into talking. I mean, it's just fucking crazy what Foley did to himself here. And then after all of that, the 2 big bumps, the 2 thumbtack bumps, now he's picked up in the tombstone. And Taker nails him with a tombstone. Foley is pinned on the mat 1, 2, 3 with all of those thumbtacks sticking in himself. Taker's got him all in his arms and his legs. It was just brutal. And when the match was over, the crowd, the way they applauded that match, the way they showed those guys respect, I mean, it was quite the moment. And Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler were brilliant on the call. I mean, Jim Ross has some of his most iconic calls ever in that match. As God is my witness, he is broken in half. That's what I opened up this video with. And Jerry Lawler, the same thing. So, just looking back, I'm still in shock. I mean, it doesn't get any easier to look at 20 years later. I'm still every bit as amazed by this. As years go by, some other things that you might see or might be impressed with, sometimes they don't age well, sometimes they don't hold up. Sometimes you'll see a match from the 80s that you thought was good at the time, but then looking back, turns out that it wasn't all that much. This has never gotten any less crazy, and looking back on it is still fucking nuts. Main event time, WWE title on the line, Stone Cold Steve Austin defending against Kane. This was a first blood match, which everybody knows the stipulation in a first blood match, first one to bleed, loses. So that was already kind of a weird stipulation. I thought, as it is during the build to this match, Kane was just off of his feud with The Undertaker. It was actually still going on, and they had just had the Inferno match and the whole deal, so they somehow set up the first blood match. I remember on Raw, one of the segments building up to the match, I think it was on a taped show, Austin was in the ring cutting a promo with one of his pieces of merchandise on, like a baseball jersey or something, and Kane came out to the ramp to cut a promo with Paul Bearer, and they dumped a bucket of blood on Austin. I thought that was pretty good, and there was a lot of things about this feud that I really liked. But the first blood match I thought was crazy because Kane, most of his body is completely covered. So how are you going to open up Kane when Austin is out there wrestling in a fucking Speedo? So I thought he was already at a huge disadvantage defending his title. And then they had added another crazy-ass stipulation. Kane, at this time, started using the little throat gimmick, and he came out on Raw and said that if he does not beat Stone Cold Steve Austin for the title, then he will set himself on fire. He will actually light himself on fire on the pay-per-view. And hell, add Royal Rumble into that as well, because remember Royal Rumble, Kane set The Undertaker's casket on fire, then the Inferno match, now Kane's going to light his own self on fire, so WWE was all about fire back then. And it was really funny when this match started too, because they had 2 canisters of gasoline or kerosene on the outside of the ring, on the ring steps, and then Kane comes out to the ring and does his pyro thing, and these 2 giant canisters of gasoline are sitting right next to the pyro. Now, I know it's fake gasoline, it's just fucking water or Mountain Dew or whatever the hell it was. But still, imagine if it was real gasoline. You just put several hundred people in danger on the outside of the ring. If one of those flames, or if the pyro would have misfired and it would have landed on the gas, I mean, it could have been crazy. So I just got a big kick out of Kane setting off his pyro right next to the gasoline, but whatever. Austin then hits the ring. They start brawling. Austin at this time is also injured. He's got some staph infection in his elbow, and he's heavily taped up here. So he's out there just immediately brawling with Kane, and there's pretty much no rules in this because it's a first blood match. And almost immediately, the Hell in the Cell cage starts lowering. And it's funny, I always look back on this pay-per-view, I think of this as two Hell in the Cell matches because whenever I think of Kane and Austin fighting in this match, I think of them being inside the cell because the cell was down for most of this match. They never really revealed who was responsible for lowering the cell. We would have to guess that it was Vince McMahon controlling it or having somebody else control it for him because he was seated up in his own suite or press box with Sable watching the match. So during all this crap, Austin and Kane are brawling all over the ring and inside the cell and outside the cell because the door is open. They are just all over the place and the cell keeps going up and down. So it's just a crazy fucking match. And Kane, to make matters worse, he is fully clothed. So that early Kane outfit or costume? He had that one exposed arm. And on this night, this was the first time he started wearing the fully covered bodysuit. So he didn't have an inch of skin exposed on him. So unless Austin opened up his head, and in which case the blood would still be really hard to see, I didn't see how Austin was going to win this match. However, I remember me and my friends sitting there speculating because we were all little fucking know-it-all marks. And we all said the same thing. We were like, oh, it's totally obvious. Austin's going to retain the belt because Kane has got a full bodysuit on. That must be some way to gimmick him lighting himself on fire without getting injured. Because back at Unforgiven, they had put some weird sleeve thing on his arm and lighted him on fire. So we were thinking that maybe they've devised some new way or some new effect to light him on fire without burning him or hurting him. And maybe the full bodysuit is a way to protect him. So we were all pretty sure, even though we had no idea how Austin was going to make Kane bleed, we were certain Austin was going to win. So the ending got really crazy. You got the cell down, going up and down. You got Paul Bearer on the outside of the ring. Austin and Kane are brawling all over the place. And then you have crazy-ass Mankind, who should be in the hospital attached to 9 different machines. He comes out there with a fucking chair and tries to interfere in the match. And it's so funny to watch back. When he gets in the ring and starts, quote-unquote, brawling with Austin, you can tell that Austin does not want to hit him. Austin knows the hell he just went through. Mick Foley's his friend. And when Austin starts fighting back with Foley, his punches are so weak. He is being so careful not to hurt Mick Foley any worse. Eventually, he wound up hitting Mick Foley with the stunner. Mick Foley powders out for a minute. And then The Undertaker starts hobbling down to the ring on that bad ankle. And he's got a chair in hand. And at this time, Austin is in the ring. Mick Foley gets back up after taking the stunner. He's right in between Taker and Austin. Austin also has a chair in his hand, and Undertaker supposedly goes to swing for Mankind. Mankind ducks, and he nails Austin chair to chair. Taker's chair hits Austin's chair, and Austin's chair flies right back into his face, and Austin blades hard. And so he's laying there in the ring in a pool of blood, and then it gets even crazier. Undertaker goes and gets the 2 gas canisters, and the referee, who's been knocked out in all the commotion, he pulls the referee up from the ground and throws him back in the ring, grabs the 2 cans of gas, and starts dumping the gas all over the referee. And then Kane attacks Undertaker and throws him out of the ring. And next thing you know, the referee starts coming to, takes one look at Austin, who just delivered a really vicious chair shot to Kane's face. And the referee, I think it's Earl, gets one look at Austin, sees the blood, and calls for the bell. And this was one of my favorite pay-per-view endings of all time. Everything was perfect here. From Austin's reaction to Howard Finkel's announcement to Jerry the King Lawler's reaction, it was such a perfect ending to the pay-per-view. But that whole combination of things, the bell ringing, Austin staring at Earl Hebner, and then Howard Finkel making the very slow announcement, and new! And then Austin throws the chair and Jerry Lawler screams out, whoa! I mean, it was just so perfect. And then Jim Ross's kind of somber tone, he's like, no, don't tell me. And then the camera kind of cuts to Vince McMahon sitting there with Sable, and Vince is very happy, and he's got this big grin on his face, and the pay-per-view goes off the air. I mean, I remember everybody in the house, we were shocked because Austin just got launched. He was crowned the man at WrestleMania just a couple of months before this. I was under the assumption that he was going to go on a long title run here and potentially hold that belt at least until the end of the summer, maybe even the next year. And this would actually lead to the very next night, which is one of my favorite Monday Night Raws ever. And it was in Cleveland. A lot of big shows took place in that arena. This was one of them. And Kane comes out to celebrate with Vince McMahon. Vince gives him the title belt. Austin crashes the party and cuts the most stone cold of stone cold promos you will ever hear. One of my favorite ones where he's, telling off Vince McMahon and he's, challenging Kane to a rematch and talking about what a pussy he is because his brother helped him out and look at how big and bad he is and he won't give him a rematch. Why don't you suck it up and have some guts? And finally convinces Kane to a rematch and then wins back the WWE title in the main event of Raw in a show that just destroyed Nitro. I remember at the time it got one of the highest rated or the highest rating in Raw history. It was an amazing show. So if you've never taken a look back at that Monday Night Raw, I'm sure it's up on the WWE Network. Fire it up and pull up June 29th, 1998. One of my favorite Raws of all time. And everything that took place at King of the Ring and on that Monday Night Raw was one of my favorite weekends in professional wrestling history. It really was. 1998 was a glorious time, and I remember it well. So anyway, there you go. Thank you very much for hanging out with me today and taking a look back at this very memorable and significant pay-per-view in WWE history. I'm sure you guys all have your memories of the Hell in the Cell match. If you weren't watching wrestling at the time or you weren't born yet or whatever, I'm sure you've seen the match by now. So if you want to share your opinions on that crazy match and this crazy night in wrestling, feel free to leave it in the comments below. Next time you hear from me will be in just a few days, and one of the things I like to do now for those of you that actually stay tuned to the end of these commentaries, I like to give you guys a little preview of what you're going to see next. My next special video will be a DVD review coming up in just a few days, and it will be on the Mr. McMahon 2 DVD set that the WWE released about 12 years ago. It's a pretty old DVD, but I will be reviewing that, and that will hit the channel here in just a few days, so stay tuned for that. So you guys take care. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you real soon. Until then, peace.